Hello and welcome to the channel. As always, like the video, and if you enjoyed the story, leave a comment on if you would want more. This fan fiction was not created by me, but in the description there is a link to the fanfic so you can show your support to the creator and read along. Without any more delay, let's dive into the story.
Chapter 15. Naruto stared at his new foxy accessories in horror. "Do you like it?" the demon's voice mocked from within his mind. "I did some redecorating while I was out," it teased. "I really think it brightens up this dreary old place. Don't you think so?" "Ho! How?" The boy pulled on one of his new ears. "It hurt, a lot." "Careful, they're sensitive," the demon teased. "What did you do?" the boy cried out in shock. "Oh, a bit of this, a bit of that, nothing really all that significant," the fox roared with mocking laughter. "But, how is it still here?" the boy demanded. "Find out for yourself, why don't you?" his prisoner sniffed, knowing it was being cruel by not answering. Life really sucked sometimes. The first thing Naruto discovered the fox had done was when he tried to hide his new accessories, and bungled the technique twice in a row before he finally figured out what was wrong. Whatever the fox had done increased his chakra stores enormously, but he wasn't going to call that a good thing, as it had utterly destroyed his control. Where before it had been like trying to control a fire hose, now, when he called upon his chakra, it was like trying to aim a geyser. Yes, the force was many times greater, but without control all of that power was meaningless. It had set him back to his academy level, where he had the worst control of any would-be ninja in the village's history. With his ability to control his chakra this messed up all of his techniques were shot, he couldn't even make more than 200 shadow clones. His basic clones were back to looking half dead. The boy sat down and wept when he discovered that. All of that hard work, all of that effort, gone. Just gone. "Damn you, fox," he shouted inside of his mind. "Don't talk like that," the demon scolded. "I am not your enemy. I cannot be. I have sworn to destroy your enemies, and the Celestial Emperor forces us to keep our oaths. So when you proposed a bargain, and I agreed, and you paid my price, our deal was sealed. Even if the price was not all I'd been hoping, you still paid it, and I am still bound. Don't make any mistake, I am not your friend. But I don't care to destroy myself, so I don't dare be your enemy either." There came some cruel chuckling. "That doesn't mean I can't annoy or even torment you, however." "But, my friends. Come on, admit it," the demon teased. "All of Konoha are your enemies. I only did my job by destroying them for you." The boy froze, thinking. But that means, if Hinata gets murdered. Yes, he could feel the demon gloating, almost imagine the wide, toothy grin. "That's what I'm hoping. If she does get murdered again, I might just be let loose to go avenge her again." Naruto gathered himself enough to shoot a cruel jibe back. "I wouldn't count on it, Fluffy. Since Orochimaru is out there, and you aren't free to go out and track down him. Why don't you give it a try?" the demon shot back, angrily. "Go and slit that pretty little neck of hers with your kunai. I just might be let loose to avenge her, by killing you. Perhaps I'll get full freedom after all." "Only an enemy would propose such a thing," Naruto sneered right back. Suddenly he could feel the demon's shock a moment before its pain. He was just as surprised as it was at this happening. "F4, forgive me," it stuttered out between clenched teeth, still angry but now in immense anguish as its powers started to turn upon itself. "Why should I?" he shot back the words it had used on him the other night. "I'd be far better off if you were dead. And now. Don't be too. Oh, you, hasty," it gasped out. "IIEAAH. I can, still be. UUOOH, useful. What? You're going to teach me some techniques? What would I care for useless human skills?" it gasped out at a silly, high-pitched whine as its pain jumped up to another threshold. "What could you teach an ant about its profession?" Naruto touched his lip, thinking of what he could ask for. "A bloodline? I have none to offer. The fox writhed, lashing about worse than Sasuke did when he lost his balls. WHHH. And would you do if an ant drone came and demanded you make it a queen? Then, if you don't have anything to offer. He teased it right back. I know mysteries of life beyond everything your human medics have to offer, it screamed, actually eating itself out from the inside now. But how many apply to humans? The fox did not answer, writhing in torment. Perhaps it had no answer. Naruto grinned. The fox was going to die, and by the looks of it he was going to be free of his prisoner forever. Master, it called out in agony. Forgive your humble slave. He thought about that for a moment. Okay. As soon as that, the demon's pain was over. So, Naruto cheerfully shot back. What can you do to give me my chakra control back? But he got no answer. On investigation he found his passenger comatose from oath-inflicted injuries, closer to destruction than he would have thought. It looked like he'd caught it barely a heartbeat short of dead, and in a way that its own tremendous power could not immediately fix. Made sense, in a way, as it had been its own tremendous power causing it. Great, the boy groused. Now I get the fox to do what I want, and what can it do? Nothing. It's too close to dead. Faye, my life sucks sometimes. The boy stood, looking around his dingy old apartment, and sighed. Well, I can't stay here. If I miss the test, Kakashi and my team will come looking for me, and it will be worse if they find me like this. I can't go to the library in this condition, and I can't transform. All of my techniques are completely shot. Dang. It was back to stage 1. And he'd been so close. No brooding, he scolded himself. That way lies the Uchiha side. Well, glancing at his jacket, he picked it up and began to put it on. No way out but through, sometimes. Let's see what the villagers think of this. Halfway through getting ready, Naruto already had on a wide, prankster grin. Naruto bounced down the road grinning like a loon, his new ears twitching every which way and tail swishing along merrily behind him. The reaction of the villagers was intense. While normally they glared and sneered at him, today that was accompanied by pasty white faces filled with fear. In fact, terror seemed to overcome hatred in most of those cases. Looking in the mirror after donning his clothes, newly tailored to fit his tail through a hole in the back, he discovered he had a total of 4 ears, his usual 2 on the sides of his head, and now this new set decorating the top. All of them were fully functional. In fact, the new set functioned like a pair of parabolic microphones, in that they could pick up sounds that were really faint or far away, so long as they were pointed that direction. And they kept twitching around uncontrollably. Naruto must have located 100 rats that he'd never noticed before on his way to the testing center. Oi! Hinata-chan! Wait up! We can walk the rest of the way together. He called out to his favorite person, and she stopped and waited for him. Amazingly, she didn't react at all to his foxy accessories, just smiling and happy to be walking with him. Must think there's some kind of prank, Naruto thought, then grinned even wider. Well, that is something I would do. At that, he could hardly repress a merry chuckle. Oh yes. He could do stuff with this. Naruto. Stop fooling around. Sakura called back to nag him on her way past to greet the Uchiha. Kiba, coming up to greet Hinata, as she was his teammate, looked Naruto up and down, then sniffed a couple of times. Oi, I don't get it. He told Naruto, scratching his own chin. You smell like a fox, and look like one, too. What's the gag? Naruto smiled so wide he had to close his eyes to make room for it as he shot his hand high and called out loud, Hey! I thought I'd have to be really clever to pass this test, and so I dressed the part. Half of the younger set broke out laughing, while some among the older ones looked on, horrified, but then they rolled their eyes and scowled at his bad taste. By noon it would be all over town that the clown had done it as a prank on everyone. This, from the inventor of the sexy technique, and it would be totally believable, too. Their anger would spike a bit, but the relief would largely drown it out. As they entered the testing zone together, his team plus Hinata's, which meant that Lee would not be making an appearance to fight Sasuke, they walked right up to the disguised Chunnin team guarding the illusionary door. The pair turned pasty white upon spotting Naruto, and the gleeful Chunnin raised his perfectly human nose to the air, declaring, "Something smells fishy here." He smiled, baring his ordinary human teeth at the Chunnin. The pair drew back, drawing weapons, hands trembling. "Hinata-chan." Naruto dived toward her book bag. "You didn't tell me you brought tuna. We'll have to go out to lunch together later." The Chunnin gave heartfelt sighs and relaxed, while the crowds of genin looking on began laughing at their antics, and at Hinata's rosy blush. When they got outside the testing room door, Kakashi and Kurenai, who were waiting for them, saw Naruto among the kids and instantly stiffened, going from casual and relaxed stances to alert and battle-ready ones. "Oi! Kakashi!" Naruto called out, having one of the times of his life. "I let the Kyuubi out last night to catch a rabbit and look what he did to me." The two jonin face-flopped. "Naruto!" Kakashi scolded, as the pair of teachers got up from the floor, rubbing their foreheads. "You must not joke like that. Drop that disguise before someone hurts you for it." "No," the boy laughingly retorted. "I don't feel like it." He adopted a very unconvincing pose of sudden feral impulses. "In fact, I can't," he wheezed out through exaggerated front teeth. "I am being overcome by my impulses. The instincts of a fox are taking hold. I must kiss Hinata-chan." And he turned around and proceeded to do so, loudly, messily, and noisily, but to her great delight. The whiskers added an extra something to it, he was sure, as she'd never wriggled in enjoyment quite that way before. Kurenai put her face in her hand. Kakashi rolled his eyes and poofed away to go read porn. Naruto was grinning as he made out with Hinata right there in the hallway. By overacting, everyone assumed this was a prank. And they expected pranks from him. Especially ones in bad taste. This was working. When they entered the testing chamber, Naruto stood forth and challenged the entire room, shouting, "Oi! My name is Naruto Uzumaki. Living container for the nine-tailed demon fox. And..." He began to twitch, acting out spasms, the seal. "It's breaking. It's breaking. Naruto." Sakura clobbered him on the head, knocking him down off of the top of the desk. So she scolded him where he lay on the floor. "Don't make lame jokes like that. It isn't funny." The class, tense as brittle glass, relaxed at this statement, rolling their eyes and passing it off as just another lame joke from a class clown. It was priceless, one of the best jokes ever. He was very nearly admitting the truth and no one would believe him. It almost made up for utterly destroying his abilities as a ninja. Almost, but not quite. Getting up and rubbing his head a little, he caught the flat and hostile gazes of the Sand siblings from across the room. So he hopped over there directly. "Hey! Gaara! How is Shikaku? Is the one-tailed demon raccoon treating you right? Can you tell him the Kyuubi says hi? What do you want?" Gaara asked him low and level, his gaze hostile. "To make out with your sister," the clown teased. Gaara blinked, nonplussed. Then he thought about it. "All right." Naruto's face went slack in surprise. "Gaara?" Temari pled with her brother, plainly horrified. "Demon containers need their lovin'," he told her in flat, unemotional tones. Temari looked at her younger brother, terrified, before turning a wan smile on the blonde boy. "So, where shall we do this?" I dunno." The Konoha genin temporized, looking around for a way out of this. Spotting his salvation on the other side of the room, he grinned. "Hey! Hinata-chan! You've got girlfriend rights. So you have veto power. Do you mind if I make out with this sand chick here?" Already turning back to tell Temari thanks, but no thanks, he heard Hinata stutter out behind him. "And no, I could say, alright." His jaw practically scraped the floor. Turning back, he shouted, "Hey! Are you sure? I'd hate to hurt your feelings. It's okay to tell me no. No," she stuttered, playing with her fingertips. "It's all right. You go ahead. I wouldn't want to be your first time. So go ahead and do whatever." Her nerve broke and she hid behind Shino, would cut out stare a carving. Naruto got a wan smile of his own, and turned back to the Sand siblings, where Gaara was looking at him with a "well, get on with it" expression. Naruto gulped. The QB container was utterly humiliated. First, the demon sends his chakra all out of whack, messing with his control so badly that it was impossible to reliably use any of his techniques except Shadow Clone, and that was down to 5% of his previous numbers. Having no control sucked. Then, they passed the written test as usual, and when they went on to the expected Orochimaru fight, Naruto had hung back, teasing Sasuke, and the creepy of Snake Guy had beaten up Sasuke, bitten him, then let them pass. Worse yet, Sakura had hung all over the Uchiha all night long, when Naruto couldn't even get a camping technique to go right, and the screwy Uchiha had somehow managed to live through the night. So much for healing techniques. Apparently it was all Sakura, although what she did except fret and moisten his forehead with a rag was beyond the boy. No, that was a big-time blow to his ego. First, the fight was all Sasuke, then his survival was all Sakura. Wasn't anything he did going to matter? Didn't he make any difference in this town? Sometimes he just didn't know why he cared anymore. Getting beat up on by the sound team made him afraid, but when he fought Kiba in the preliminary matches, after having been saved out of the forest by Kabuto again, it got confirmed. His chakra control hadn't been all he'd lost. Somehow, when the demon beast had been out, it had done more than left him with fox ears. His body was now stronger and faster, and a few inches taller. He guessed that no one had noticed, mostly because of the ears. But while that could have been a good thing, it wasn't. Why? Because it had destroyed what martial arts ability he'd had. Oh, if he'd had the muscle memory, then he probably could have adapted. If it had come to him gradually, then he probably wouldn't even noticed adapting to those changes. But coming at him all at once, when he still had to think through all of those complex motions, and now the motions he'd memorized were all slightly off. The boy took Hinata off to a corner so he could cry on her shoulder after losing his match against Kiba. His unarmed fighting skills were now worse than before, thrown off by his changes and not even having the brawling spirit he'd relied upon before. And he couldn't retrain until he had enough chakra control back to perform the needed transformations to disguise himself under. He'd not even been able to summon a fart when he'd needed one. No, in that match he'd been humiliated, and on top of that he'd felt terrible about not cheering Hinata on in her match against her cousin, when he knew she'd needed him to, but when doing so would have led to her getting hurt. Failing at the prelims was as far as he'd ever gotten, yet he'd lost everything to get there. And he hadn't even gotten through. Couple of resets worth of research had turned up several interesting things that concern Naruto's new problem, while making no apparent difference in the nature of the injuries of the slumbering fox. Chakra had a spiritual component. One's chakra could also have a physical effect on the body, as that was where Naruto got both his original whisker marks, as well as his regeneration. Apparently, pulling off that seal had sent such a surge of the demon's chakra through his body that even after the reset, there was enough still free, added to his own, to have greatly amplified his already present marks. Either that or something about the surge of energy had imprinted on his chakra system the idea that his body ought to be more fox-like, and so his body had gone ahead and regenerated the missing pieces. It wasn't like there were books already written about this. Naruto had to do some guessing on his own, and he knew they might not be accurate. All of this research had to be performed on the sly, of course. The people at the library had already been bad enough without his changes. But, at least he got to practice his arts of stealth and information gathering during the odd times he was feverishly going over his chakra control exercises again, trying to regain some of what he'd lost. It would be a long route to get there, however. So he might as well practice his ordinary, non-chakra powered techniques of simply sneaking around and hiding, working out with wires, What could be done without chakra to enhance their strength and lengthen and/or contract them? It left him feeling like only half a ninja, at most. Naruto didn't have tons to do while slowly rebuilding his chakra control. All things seemed to wait on it, so he was at his wits' end the first couple of weeks trying to have something that could occupy his mind other than the interminable chakra training drills. He'd shown next to no progress during that time, and it was a matter of mental survival to find some way to distract himself from his frustrations. And no, the QB hadn't shown any clear improvement in all that period. It might as well have been dead, except it wasn't. Naruto wasn't that lucky. So he began churning through books at the library at an increased pace, sneaking in and smuggling them out because they wouldn't let him inside, and one of those books was on metallurgy. That gave Naruto pause. Here he was bored practically out of his mind. The Uchiha lands had a couple of smithies on it, and shinobi did use weapons and armor. So, if he wanted to, this was something he could pursue while working to get his chakra control back. So he did it. Konoha did have several blacksmiths who repaired or created weapons and armor. At first, after finding out where those were, he did some spying on them to watch what they did, but that grew boring very quickly as what they did never changed on his unending day. So he gathered up what money he had and sent Hinata to special order things. The darling girl never objected to those requests, and felt privileged and honored to do so for him, no matter how weird it was what he wanted her to order, and whenever possible she'd kick in her own money to help. He loved that girl. No one else was like her. An entire town hating his guts, and she was the sweetest thing to him, in spite of having so little confidence herself. Anyway, with her help and some practice concealing himself so he could spy and observe, he got a smithing education. Most of the shops had apprentices, so often enough he could secretly listen as the master taught the younger smith, often a relative, how to do this or that, and parabolic ears were really useful to overhear what they were saying as they did so. Since the various shops that had apprentices had them at different levels, he could have Hinata order the same thing at different places each day to pick up more than he'd known before, starting with the basics. So, having picked up what he could by secretly observing and reading what he could from books, he figured out how to get Sarutobi to grant him the Uchiha properties in spite of his new appearance, picked up a hammer and went to work giving it a try. Only to immediately go back to hit the books and overhear some more, as he had obviously missed some important stuff. Then he had to struggle to figure out the pieces he couldn't arrange to overhear, but after that things got better. With lots of spare time to experiment in, he even got pretty good. It took him a while, but just about any ordinary person could be trained by a smith to be a smith in about 6 months, more if you wanted the specialized, detail-oriented stuff, and Naruto was anything but ordinary. He'd learned harder techniques faster, and with less help than he had here. Okay, granted, the frequent resets were actually a detriment for him here as he had very little ability to see the progress of his own work, as what he couldn't make in a day and a half didn't happen, as he'd either reset or be off in the forest of death by then. So, still having ability to produce shadow clones, albeit much reduced, he put them to work helping him, he himself learning to make small pieces or bits of larger ones that he then put them to work crafting other days while he went on to learning other parts of those same projects. It was not long before he had a decent skill level, but he did not stop there. He had no reason to. There was more to learn and he was bored, so he began to go from the ordinary village smith level of pot hammerer and nailmaker on to crafting weapons and armor as had originally interested him. It took him no time at all to find out that his tools sold to him by the villagers had to have been special made to be as bad as they were. Cheap metal, dull blades nothing could effectively sharpen, and balance so bad it could not have been an accident. Naruto was crafting better on his first, clumsy attempts. Then, as he grew competent on basic ninja tools, he branched outwards, finding himself working on swords and samurai armor, giant blades similar to Zabuza's gigantic cleaver, even branching out yet further making clocks and other intricate mechanisms. He even started crafting intricate little toys for himself. Why? Because there was more to learn and he was bored. Besides, he got to play with them, after. He got into a clockmaking thing because many of the armor pieces had joints and fasteners more intricate than he could arrange to overhear instructions for, and the only books in the library he could find that dealt with small, precision things were about clockmaking. So he did so. And then later lockmaking, learning how to make all sorts of intricate things, from sturdy bolts to complicated puzzle locks, granting far greater security than he'd ever enjoyed. Then, when he took that back to the armor pieces, he found he was actually quite good at it, really amazingly good at it. And, by necessity, he was fast. If he wasn't fast, the project couldn't get done and he wouldn't learn if it was any good or not. Soon, his clones all working together and occupying 2 shops to do it, he could have himself wearing a full suit of armor in half a day. But, as he did so, he found the stuff clunky and uncomfortable, restricting his movements and heavy, so it slowed him down. And, well, as he was already the one making it, he just fiddled with the designs a little, adding a little detail here, or adjusting a joint there, adapting a trick he'd learned from making joints on toy soldiers to make something less awkward and more comfortable to wear, and so on. There are several details restricting the nature of armor in general. One of those was the materials used, and he hadn't any unusual abilities there, but another was the skills of the craftsman involved, which in his case were shooting up remarkably fast as he wanted desperately for something to occupy his mind, and so fiddled with everything, playing with details and doing the work over and over until he was becoming almost frightfully good. And a further limiter on armor and weapon quality was the amount of time a smith was willing to put into not only creating it, but fine-tuning it to get it all right, personalizing the fittings for optimal use and flexibility by one individual. And, well, time was something he had too much of. By the time he'd devised, and redevised, reworked and re-engineered every conceivable, and more than a couple of ridiculous, complete sets of ninja outfitting for himself, he began to do the same for Hinata, then Tenten, Ino, Temari, then Gaara and Kankuro, until Kurenai chased him away when he approached her with a tape measure. He didn't want to outfit his teammates. They could go without as far as he was concerned. But anyone else was fair game, and he'd gotten a fair bit into creating a set for Shikamaru until he decided that didn't interest him anymore. It wasn't new any longer. Still, there was plenty to do with refining the sets he'd already started. He'd find pretexts to get those people to try on his work until he could confidently say he'd gotten them right. Only, by then, his standards of right were pretty awesome, including a precisely calibrated fit and amazing balance. He got that good by having a great ability to learn, near infinite time available, plenty of willing help in the form of shadow clones who knew as much as he did, an inexhaustible supply of materials to work with, as whatever he used one day was still available to him the next, and most people, when faced with a project, are willing to say good enough because they don't want to undo, then redo, all of the work they'd done before. And, well, since Naruto had to redo all of that work anyway, there was never a good enough point to stop him. He'd also check for protective value, at first by hanging those suits of armor on dummies, then pounding them to scrap metal with swords, knives and other weapons, some he devised, but others he found lying around the Uchiha estate. And he wasn't satisfied if he could slip in a sunbond needle before he'd warped the metal under his attacks. Then he went to work to devise armor that didn't warp so easily when he pounded on it. Why? Well, it seemed all he had was time, and it might matter someday. Also, he got to try and adapt what he knew of martial arts to his new body, thinking through each step and trying to compensate for his changes, while he pounded those armor sets to scrap as targets. It didn't have the ease or satisfaction of getting taught, but it was doing some good. If nothing else, it made him not feel so trapped and helpless. It was hard to describe his disappointment over losing the use of his chakra techniques, but this smithing, and, to a lesser degree, martial arts, was a skill he could keep so long as he still had all of his limbs and a sound body, none of which he was likely to lose so long as he could regenerate. He'd learned that when Kakashi had blown a hole through his chest. During this time he was also practicing stealth and information gathering. Before, it had almost been too easy for him to shapeshift and then learn whatever secrets he wanted by being in the form of a student, someone who had that knowledge wanted to teach. Now, it was more difficult. Not only was he the demon brat, he had those stinking fox ears marking him even more distinctly, rendering him easy to notice even when he'd changed out of his orange jumpsuits and adopted less loud and obvious mannerisms. Still, being harder only made it so he had more to learn, and an admittedly more difficult time getting there. But he had a good start, from breaking in to steal the Uchiha scrolls and manuals on that subject, so he at least knew what he had to do in order to get started. Thing like his waving tail gave him away at first, but even that he learned how to control and compensate for eventually. So he began hunting secrets. Not any particular secrets, just secrets in general. He began by breaking into the houses of Sasuke's fangirls to read their diaries, just on the odd chance that he could get something to help him understand why they all drooled over him so much. It didn't help much. Girl speak might as well have been a code. But code breaking was also a part of the ninja profession, so he went about breaking it, or trying to anyway. Soon he discovered that he was lacking the key, and, in the principle of all code breaking, he needed to either find or divine the answers. So, out of that desire he began to hang around bathhouses, a safe distance away, not peeking, just listening into their conversations with his parabolic ears to see what they talked about when they were all alone. It was an entirely different language. The words were the same, but the meanings? Still, it had some use to him. There were often nuggets of insights in there, just buried under loads and loads of fluff. So he began doing the same tricks with ladies at restaurants, shopping, or hanging out with each other in all the places they'd go. Interesting, but even listening in on a whole village proved to be too small a sample over one day. He either had to find a way to observe over a longer space of time, impossible as he'd never yet gotten know the whole forest and the preliminary rounds, which always reset him, or find some ways to mix it up a little so that he could observe more conversations that weren't just repeats of what he'd overheard before. Little while ago he would have joined them using his sexy technique, just to be on hand to steer those conversations more interesting ways. But that route was presently closed to him. So he had to give up on the great girl decode for now, leaving that until he had more options. What he did begin to find, as he broke into more houses searching for a wider variety of things, and getting caught on occasion, but those only stirred him up to learn more, he found recipes, which he enjoyed as they generally improved his cooking skill as well as his diet. Ino had only known so much to teach him, bank account numbers, wedding photos, and all sorts of stuff, all of which he devoured. Then he happened upon song. He'd always refused voice lessons during his time at the music store. As for the Uchiha, it would have been too far outside the role he'd been playing for it to be believed. But it was music and, here was the best part, it was not limited by what he could get his fingers to do. That's right, no muscle memory restrictions there. Oh, he couldn't properly condition his voice, but that was alright, as he couldn't condition his arms to throw kunai either. Just like he couldn't go anywhere with those weight training books, or the flexibility training that all sounded so useful. He could lift all of the weights in the world and it couldn't do him any good, form splits until he bled and the next day there'd be no benefit. He could do all of the exercising he wanted, but in the end no matter the pain there would be no gain. It was that simple. But that was alright, he didn't have to worry about that, because there was still so much singing he could do without training to reach the real high-end vocal tricks and stuff. The villagers' eyes about popped out of their heads when they woke up some mornings to a 200-voice choir that was all Naruto. Okay, he didn't have the different vocal sections, having only one voice, but it wasn't bad either. They could sing a shopping list if they had to, and make it sound good. And that mattered to him, as it began to feel like there was a crack in the glacier, that the wall that held him back now wasn't perfect, that it could be gotten through. He'd just have to find those teeny tiny cracks and widen them to do it. Naruto had learned, through frequent experience, as he'd actually had to play up the whole I am a fox angle in order for the older generation who knew about his condition to take the thing as a joke, that Temari didn't know how to kiss any better than Hinata-chan. Must be lack of experience in both cases. After all, Hinata didn't have enough bravery to, and only liked him in any case, while the other was Gaara's sister and so almost as much of an outcast and pariah as he was. The odd thing was, when he was not acting over the top and weird about it, the Jonin and Chunnin of Konoha would all arrest and interrogate him for the day. So it was just easier to kiss Temari than think up new things to do each day that were sufficiently over the top to allay those suspicions. Oh well, the fox boy not only learned how to find and push her buttons until he could get her to squealing during the middle of an exam, having figured out what place in line he'd have to stand in order to sit next to her, but also how to do so before the test started, and in such a way that he could slip her the test answers so she didn't have to rely on Kankuro. Although leaving her hickeys on her inner arm in the shape of the answers proved to be too awkward, so he learned to find other methods, so when she adjusted her slightly disordered clothes and hair mussed up by cuddling, not anything particularly naughty, she just had a fragile hairstyle not having been previously tested against hugs, she'd find little slips of paper concealed on her with the answers already written on them. After she did so, she'd always give him an impressed look or two after the testing was over. Then he learned how to rig the seating arrangements so that Temari was sitting on the other side of him from Hinata, and that was best. For some strange reason, Hinata's lack of self-confidence would not let her believe that she was good enough for Naruto, thus why she'd never approached him before. And perversely, she felt much better about the whole girlfriend issue if there was another XX chromosome ally on her side, someone to take up any and all girlfriend duties Hinata herself might flub on. She felt so sure of her own failure in most every department that she felt better about anything, particularly anything important like being a good girlfriend to her precious Naruto, if she could tag team it. That way her fears could be allayed, thinking that if she failed there would be another to take over, and thus between them make sure of getting it done properly. Yes, that's crazy. She'd never been anything less than everything Naruto had ever wanted, had ever imagined wanting. But she was not the first girl to want something that didn't make sense or go crazy over insecurities. The author himself has never ceased to be amazed over the amazing leaps of illogic that particularly insecure girls are prone to, nor the outrageous and farcical plans they would come up with to pursue them. Still, while Hinata was whispering all this off in a corner in a desperate yet hushed conversation with Temari, Naruto was, perhaps unfairly, listening in with those amazingly useful fox ears, while she first confessed her fears and hopes for another girl to help her shoulder her girlfriend duties solidly. Then Temari confessed in turn that, although she thought Hinata was crazy, she was at least glad for it, as Gaara had told her that she must suitably cater to his fellow demon container's romantic needs or he would kill her. Who would have thought Gaara of being that crazy? Okay, he knew he was a demented lunatic, but that had always been on a mass murdering strain. This new twist came out of left field. But, coming from a guy who'd carved the kanji for love into his forehead. Well, the answer to that, in Naruto's mind, was pretty simple. He could set his romantic needs very low, that way Hinata could outgrow her fears of not being up to meeting them, and Temari would not have to do anything she found terribly distasteful. Yup. He was a kissing man from now on. With perhaps a hug or two, and that answer seemed to work best for them in what was an already bizarre arrangement. Even better when he got Sasuke to sit ahead of him so they could throw spitballs in his hair during the final crunch minutes while Ibiki was really cranking down the pressure and the trio had already been kissing for 40 minutes straight, with Naruto trading between the two dizzy females, made so by his increasingly expert ministrations. Yes, he was getting to be that good of a kisser. Probably no man alive had had half so much practice, and he was a great learner. And best of all, Sakura was so busy being upset during these antics that she never even thought to volunteer dropping out. And learning how to throw the spitballs without any of the examiners catching them was good ninja practice. But even after all of this, his chakra control was only barely crawling along. In the end, Naruto went to go ask the Hokage. Hey! Old man, I've got a problem. Oh? Sarutobi took his pipe out of his mouth. What problem is it, Naruto? The boy sat down heavily, shaking his head and grabbing his own hair. I've got no idea how to explain this. The Hokage leaned back, appraising him. Apparently it was serious. Why don't you start at the beginning, Naruto? That would be really hard to do, the boy admitted with a sigh. Sarutobi was nodding. Serious and complicated. Fun. Why don't you just try? You'd be surprised what you can describe if only you get started. The boy sagged, listless, in his chair. Well, I don't expect you'll believe me. What do I do if you don't? The Hokage leaned forward, lacing his hands together on his desk. Why don't you try, and I'll do my best. The boy sighed before nodding. Given how sad and serious the blonde was, the Hokage was already certain that whatever it was bad. However, a large part of him had that parental hope that it was some childish nonsense that seems grave to a young mind, while being utterly inane to an adult one. Still, he didn't hold out too much hope for that, as those were very rarely the case with Naruto, who had problems no one seemed to have resolutions for. Still, it would be nice to have it be one of those for once. However, Naruto's first words confirmed it wasn't. Okay, first thing you've got to understand is that a time-space jutsu has gone massively wrong. I've been trapped in an endless time loop. Every day is the morning of the first test of the Chunnin exam. That was the same yesterday, and it will be the case tomorrow, too. You won't recall any of this, because you never do. No one ever does. But I have lived through this one day for years now. Sarutobi's face grew grave. That is a very interesting problem, Naruto. Can you offer me any proof? The boy sighed, shaking his head, then looked guilty. Maybe, but not yet. I've got to finish my explanation first. The Hokage nodded patiently. Then proceed. Gulping, Naruto continued. It's not always only one day. When I pass a phase of the Chunnin exam, I am allowed to go on until the next one, but the moment I fail any part, one gets sent right back to the beginning. Sarutobi stopped himself from smirking. So, that was the game, was it? It had been a while since Naruto had tried to pull a prank on him, and he had to grant him points for originality, but really, the premise was transparent. He was angling for an easy promotion and an excuse to skip the exams. Not a bad idea for a genin. Well, best to see how this played out. Sighing once more, the boy groaned on, face down, heavy with sorrow. The Hokage really had to give him points for the act, it was most convincing. Ebisu had been right, drawing was a perfect method for meditating on the beauty of nature. Naruto had almost forgotten about that suggestion. It had been so long since he'd seen the special Jonin, as the teaching specialist only gave him advice he had already heard. And, since he couldn't adequately fake walking on walls, water or leaf floating, until he could do them up to Ebisu's standards, he could forget about any other training from the man. And, once he did, he could look forward to more focusing on the basic 3 ninja techniques. So, the one teacher who'd probably taught him more than all of the others combined was presently unavailable to him. That sucked. It honestly surprised him how much he'd needed this relief from all of his ninja training and duties, although it shouldn't have. He knew that he had been having a great deal of stress trying to break through his present barricades and get back, even to the level he'd been at before, but until he'd had some amount of relief from that anxiety, he hadn't realized how much it had been hurting or eating at him. He didn't even have to draw well, just looking at a thing, examining it and so on allowed him to see it in ways he'd never thought of before. It was both a marvelous change and a desperately needed outlet, bringing relief so fast he could even forget sometimes what his worries were. This habit was a lifesaver, and so he did it, and as he did it he accumulated skill and got rapidly better at it. There really was no substitute for practice in this thing, but the same rules applied to this as had with his blacksmithing, namely, he had infinite time to try everything out, get it right, explore it, and he'd never run out of materials to work with, as a drawing pad was always empty the next day, also meaning that he never hit that good enough point. It was a good counterpoint to a major frustration he was having. So far he had been totally unable to convince the Hokage of the truth of what was going on. Even when he tried to less than fully explain the situation, telling him only parts, he'd either get frustrated out of getting no useful response, or bound to a table getting tested by Sarutobi and some of Konoha's best seal experts. Still, it was not as though that latter case was entirely useless, as Naruto merely spent the time listening to their dialogue, memorizing what he could of it, only to look up those words later. It was providing a spotty and haphazard education on the nature of the art of sealing, but he'd gone far with even less complete starts. It got even better when he had the idea, and figured out how to manage, just walking into the Hokage's office, grabbing a book seemingly at random, opening it also seemingly at random, and pretending to study while he was actually pouting. In truth, what he was doing was actually studying, but pretending to pout, and in the short amount of time that it took Sarutobi to pry him out of his shell to find out what was wrong, Naruto had had a few minutes to pick up some information out of those very high-level books. Too high level, as it turned out. You couldn't build a structure from the top down, and he needed more of a base than he already had, so he'd begged and pleaded a few times and finally found out about the existence of a shinobi library of sorts. Really, he should have found out about it before. After all, he'd been to the special ANBU classrooms where they taught anatomy toward the aim of having better takedowns of target ninja, and it was all in that same building. It wasn't all that much of a library, either, just a collection of teacher resources for the A and BU classes, and even so it had been carefully vetted to make sure that nothing above a certain security limit was in there to prevent theft or infiltration attempts from having too easy a target. And there were no real techniques in there for that reason. But what it was far outweighed what it wasn't. And to Naruto it was a find even greater than coming upon Sasuke's disused scroll collection, because it was basically the Ninja Academy, only the next level up. There they taught the basics of pressure points, stealth and infiltration beyond what the academy touched on, and, yes, the basics of the sealing arts, which was exactly what Naruto needed for this situation. Devouring those, he was able to get a much better understanding of the sealing scrolls and exploding tags he already theoretically knew how to use, although they were presently inaccessible to him by reasons of way too uncertain chakra control, but also learn some of the hows and whys and basic rules of the art as a whole rather than its individual techniques. That gave him some of the grounding he'd needed to start to understand some of the higher level stuff the Hokage and his experts talked about when they began discussing his seal. Not enough, unfortunately, but something. However, something they did have was advanced chakra control theory, and a handful of exercises for training. That was more priceless than gold to the otherwise frustrated young boy. It didn't come in the form of otherwise useful techniques like wall walking or the same for water, being more mysterious and esoteric like sitting under waterfalls and feeling your flows of energy spread out through the water, how the currents could dissipate them and carry them away, then trying to follow those threads as they vanished. For an ordinary Chunnin or Jonin, such an exercise would be hard. For a Genin, impossible. But for Naruto he'd never done an easier chakra drill. Why? Well, think on the scale. For an average Chunnin, allowing their chakra to flow out in the currents of the river was akin to dumping in a bottle of ink then. Watching the patterns it made as it got swirled away. For a typical Jonin, they might have a bucket instead of a bottle of ink to use to do the same. Naruto, to use that same analogy, was capable of dyeing the river black. He didn't want to do that, of course, as part of the point was to watch your chakra flows, learning some part of its nature as it got swirled away and dispersed in the natural flow of water, and you couldn't see any patterns if you turned the entire river into ink. Nevertheless, he was perfectly capable of creating large, easy-to-read patterns and then sustaining those all day. A and BU, as they trained to do this, performed the exercise a few times a week if they were really good and serious about their training. But not even the best did more than that as they'd risk serious chakra exhaustion. So they learned as best they could from a few times and called it good. Naruto, who could not only turn the river black but keep it that way for hours on end, had nothing to fear about chakra exhaustion and could study that way all day every day. And he did so, for a time, gaining back loads of lost ground on his precious control, finally getting back to where he could use a few of the more tolerant and less control-oriented techniques, which brought him back the ability to use his unique transformation in all its various forms. That was a godsend, as it enabled him to do so much, besides getting rid of the hated ears and tail. Although, as he did so he discovered something else. He'd never even tried to sustain any of his shapeshifts long-term before, but that was exactly what he had to do if he was going to go all day long without sprouting fox ears or suffering other furry embarrassments. Naruto wanted to hold the technique all day, so he'd not ever need to explain the changes, but that was almost the same for him as drinking way too much water and then avoiding going to the bathroom. At first things seemed okay, then not so much, then the pressure built and built until it got released in spite of his best intentions. Suddenly sprouting foxy accoutrements during the middle of a written exam was even worse than walking in with them on. Particularly since the first few times it happened he'd had a guilty expression as they broke out, so he got to spend a few highly unpleasant sessions with Ibiki, who was also the head of Konoha's ANBU interrogation unit, about the extent of his foxiness and if the Kyuubi was breaking out, and they never believed that it wasn't. This was probably something extra chakra control could fix, but he set about pushing his mastery of the technique up a bit in hopes that could also help him prolong his tremendously useful changes. Sadly, although the catalog of the ANBU teaching materials collection had a good 5 books on chakra control, all but 2 of them were checked out, and one was an old thing in a language Naruto did not know. So, of course, he set about trying to learn it. And that was not all that Naruto was finding to do. He was drawing all over town, everything he could see, always amazed at where he could find beauty, and becoming quite skilled at portraits, landscapes and object studies. Some things, like Hinata, he'd drawn so many times he no longer needed to even see her to put her face, in all of its various expressions, down on paper. But this was also the time that the refinements he was able to make on his blacksmithy were growing so intricate and minor that he was having trouble sustaining his interest on the subject. So, figuring that since one craft trait had been useful for a tremendous amount of diversion, he might as well try another, he took some of Kurenai's long-ago lessons on impressing females requiring a better wardrobe to heart and began to take up tailoring. He needed new clothes, and the villagers, on the whole, did not want to sell him any, charging him outrageous prices for ordinary articles, so he figured this was the best way around their reluctance. He was thinking that, like his dingy apartment, he could turn his does-not-impress females' wardrobe into something far more worthy of their notice. And in a way he was lucky he'd made that choice, as it presented as much of a body of study material as blacksmithing did, so provided a great amount of relief and distraction from his ordinary ninja woes. Although, not unlike metalworking, he could put some of those skills to use on creating ninja equipment for himself and, later on, his friends. Konoha had some good standard uniforms, but they were just that, standard. So long as you were making outfits yourself anyway, there was no reason not to include cargo pockets exactly where and how you wanted them, hidden pockets for things an enemy might not know to search for, and get the comfort, fit in materials the way you like them instead of going for off-the-rack garbage. Having begun to make his own gear in other areas, Naruto had rapidly learned to prefer doing it that way, as he didn't have to settle for anything, and could make it exactly the way he wanted it every time. Then should he learn that it needed reinforcement at the knees, or whatever, he could do it rather than protest uselessly to an uncaring clerk who sold everything generic. Since having trained with Tenten, he figured he would be using a lot of scrolls after he got his abilities back, so he could include more places to carry those conveniently, and where he could more easily get at them, than the standard outfit that only had room for roughly 10 or so. It was like metalworking. Everything could be made exactly how he wanted it to precisely match his own unique needs, improving how much use he could easily get out of his equipment. And, like with metalworking, there were useful side additions to that skill, like how to properly embroider or make lace, that were not necessarily central to the trade, but did have a ton of things that he could learn and so add to the volume of how much he could usefully distract himself by studying. Lace patterns were like puzzles, too, in that some had fairly simple patterns with a small number of bobbins, around a dozen or so for medium complex designs, all the way up to specialized, highly complex, 200 bobbin patterns that were simply gorgeous, and breathtakingly rare, as so few had mastered the skill of how to do them, not to mention how time-consuming they were. Then there was knitting, which could be used to adapt just about any fiber into thread. So, if he wanted to hang around the Inuzuka clan kennel for a day, he could make himself a dog fur sweater while out in the forest. That was another good aspect to sewing, it was portable. When he made things out of metal he'd needed a forge with loads of tools to do it in, but he could sew practically anything with tools he could hold in his lap. So he could pursue his knitting even while out in the forest of death. Embroidery was like drawing, in that just about any pattern could be created. And that made it flexible, too. Unlike drawing, it had special techniques you had to master in order to be able to do this instead of that, but those merely presented a new body of material to learn, and thus a distraction from his misery at having pathetic ninja skills. Although, he was no longer trailing nearly so badly behind in that department anymore. Having access to his own unique shapeshift technique had enabled him to go through the route of relearning his martial arts. So, while he was once more hitting that same upper limit again soon, at least he had the skills of a top rookie genin instead of a dead last. That was comforting. Not super, but comforting. And this time he had a wee bit more utility out of it, as his strength and speed were superior to before. Not enough to beat Kiba superior, he tried, and failed, to do so many times, but that this doesn't suck so much as it did anymore superior. He still lagged way behind the actual martial arts specialists, but he could do more damage than someone with only average body conditioning. That was helpful, as previously, well, he wasn't a dead last, as there were still people like Sakura out in the ninja world, but he had sucked pretty badly. And, by sneaking any old scroll out of Sasuke's apartment, he could do the whole thing with meeting and training alongside Tenten, too. That quickly brought up his throwing weapon skills once again, despite his longer reach and changed body having thrown him off before. So, having two departments in which he was no longer quite so sucky made him feel much less of a low-grade academy student, and at least more of a competent genin once more. Not the Chunnin he felt he'd been, but still better than before. Anyway, having access to his ability to shapeshift again gave him options that he didn't have recently, like the ability to follow through on some of the plans he'd made for the Great Girl Decode. Still, it wasn't like that went fast, as even once he'd steered one of those conversations onto Sasuke, the fangirls would squeal, "Oh, he lost his family. He's been through so much suffering. He must be so tender." In a moment of carelessness, sexy Naruto blurted out, "BAH. He wouldn't know tenderness if it bashed him upside the head." All of the other girls glared at him, her. Okay, more tact was called for. Very early on Naruto had tried, not long after Ebisu had told him about how unique and strong his transformation technique was, approaching Kakashi as his favorite student and demanding training. Sasuke never asked. But all the lazy jonin would do would be to agree, and then say, "Use your Sharingan to copy this." Which pretty much sucked, because without the Sharingan all Naruto could do was memorize the hand seals, and that wasn't half of knowing how to actually perform it. He'd need more data than that to even invent his own form of it. That was the reason why he didn't already have every ninja technique in Konoha, or at least the 1,000 or so Kakashi had copied. However, now he was able to wear his sullen teammate's face once more. The trickster of Konoha had another idea on that regard that just might work. So, he approached Kakashi while both looking and acting like the Uchiha and grumbled, "Teach me seals." Kakashi looked at him a moment, then nodded and took him off to a teacher on that subject, one of the ANBU who'd first taught him. Naruto wasn't able to hold up the shapeshift for very long, but even so the fragmentary lessons he began to pick up that way made a big difference in his understanding of that art. And, to his most happy delight, it turned out to be one where chakra control was almost meaningless. Okay, the art required a great deal of precision and control to get it right, but those were demanded as part of the scribing down of the seals, choosing the correct ones, and selecting the right diagram for your purpose. The actual activation required only a surge of chakra, no more complicated in most cases than activating an explosive tag, which was something Naruto could do. No, once he'd learned that much he was immediately back to using storage scrolls and explosive tags again, as he hadn't previously dared, not wanting to mess up spacetime any more than it already was, or potentially destroy Konoha with an overpowered tag. Now that he didn't have that worry he could use them again, and more. This looked like an art he could have a great deal of fun with. So, he began to learn it at an increased pace, pressing for more time with those seal teachers by really cranking down hard on the impulse to revert to his true face and recent foxy form. He began to experiment on his own in ways on how he might make it easier to sustain. Oi! Ino! Shikamaru! Wait up! What do you want? The team whose members he'd named turned around to face the boy, with Ino putting a hand on her hip to confront him and act as spokesperson. You've heard the news of the Sand and Sound teams, right? Naruto didn't pause for confirmation, only stopping before them to take out a scroll and unseal a pair of tidy stacks of equipment. Holding one of something up to Ino, he told her, "Here, you're going to need this." Armor? She gaped at it disbelievingly, then shook her head. Sorry, Naruto, but it's not my style. I'm not a close combat type. Exactly. He shot her a huge grin. That's exactly my point. You're not a close combat type. But we're ninja, right? So, the whole point is deception, right? So, if you show up to our forest test today decked out in combat armor and with a couple of swords strapped on your back, people are going to think you are a combat type, right? Shikamaru blinked a couple of times, processing this idea. Grudgingly, he gave it approval. By dressing this way, ninja from other villages are going to think our greatest weakness is our strength. So instead of attacking us directly in head-on fights, where Ino and I are at our worst, they will try other options. This could give us a much better chance at passing this test. Naruto continued to grin widely. Not just other villages. We are the youngest group of genins taking the test, and none of the older students know much about us. Mostly they don't care about younger kids enough to learn about our abilities. Here, put that on. He tossed a bundle of clothes to Choji, who unfolded the top item to find a robe patterned in an elaborate flame style. There are matching shirt and pants to go with it, Naruto told him. Shikamaru was thinking, rubbing his chin. So Ino and I dress up as close combat experts, while Choji, who is our combat expert, dresses up as a fire technique specialist who is boasting about his abilities in his art. That way, if we are attacked, most ninja would avoid Ino and me, while rushing in to hit Choji, believing that he would be our weak point. How did you think of this? The entire team blinked at Naruto, who shrugged and grinned. Like I said, the entire point of being a ninja is deception. You know I don't have any close friends. What did you think I did with all of my time? I spent it studying to learn how to do things. I just played the fool because I didn't care to give away my abilities. But now that it's a matter of life or death for us, I figured I could show you a few things to your advantage. And with this stuff, even if it doesn't fool anyone, there is still a much reduced chance of a stray kunai or senbon taking you out. Shikamaru was nodding. It was a very sensible strategy. I would like to play a game of shogi with you later. Naruto's grin widened. I look forward to it. Then he stood up. Here, let me help you guys put this gear on. Some of the joints and fasteners are a wee bit tricky. I've never worn anything like this before, Ino confessed. Don't worry. You'll find that it fits you like a glove. Here, you go slip into the undersuit, and after you have that on I'll show you how to don the rest of it. After I show you, I'll also leave you with a set of instructions for putting it on and taking it off so you don't have trouble camping tonight. Meanwhile, not far away, another group of Konoha genin was being stopped by another clone of Naruto. Oi! Shino! Hinata-chan! Wait up! Gaara, wait! Naruto calmly walked into the threat zone and held up a hand, so non-threatening and unafraid that the demon container from sand paused in the act, just before crushing Sasuke to death. Naruto turned to face Sakura, who was trembling. Sakura, Sasuke is in the grasp of Gaara's sand, which is unescapable and can crush stones, only you can save him now. Giving a disbelieving glance to her blonde teammate, the pink-haired girl nonetheless sucked in her lower lip and nervously drew a kunai, looking over to the implacable face of the boy from sand. Naruto rolled his eyes and swatted the kunai out of her hands. Not like that, he scolded her. You can't beat him in a fight, don't even try. In fact, Gaara, would you mind if I threw a kunai at your shoulder, just to show her? Taking the hostile, flat, unfriendly stare as a yes, Naruto drew his own and tossed it gently and underhand toward the demon of sand. The expected shield stopped it cold, and Naruto nodded. You see? His defenses are automatic, and nearly invulnerable. If you approached him with hostile intent he could grind you into a thin red paste without really trying. Gaara, would you mind bending that to ruin, just to show her you can? In seconds, without Gaara even having to move a muscle, the sands had twisted the kunai into an unrecognizable mass of metal. Sakura's eyes were wide and she was trembling in fear, realizing now the extent of their danger, or some of it at any rate. As I said, Sasuke is already dead, unless you save him, Naruto told his female teammate, playing on an idea that making out with Temari had given him earlier, just to see if it worked. But how? The Kunoichi objected. I can't fight that guy. I never thought you could. Naruto returned. I don't expect you to try. No, you are going to save Sasuke's life by paying for it in a way that Gaara may willingly take in return for letting him go. She looked fearfully between him and the demon from sand, nervously touching her chin with one hand. But I haven't any money on me. The blonde boy shook his head. No, and I wouldn't expect him to take it, even if you did. Then what? She demanded, getting upset at all these riddles. Demon containers need their lovin', he told her in direct, no-nonsense tones, acting on the suspicion that people often do for others what they'd most want to get themselves. Gaara's eyes widened almost imperceptibly, and the sand he'd been sending out to grasp those two paused in its forward creep. Think of it this way, only your love can save Sasuke now. But to save him you have to give up on him and give that love to Gaara instead. I imagine that can be a temporary thing, but don't expect more than you pay for. If you give the boy a nervous peck on one cheek, I imagine he might let Sasuke go after having only pulverized his legs and arms into useless, mangled flesh, pulled out his eyes and crushed his balls into liquid, a maimed and useless cripple but not dead. A serious kiss on the lips might save Sasuke's legs. A complete makeout session with hugs might be worth those plus his arms, while I imagine that if you really impress Gaara, you might actually be able to get Sasuke free unharmed. Don't hold back, though, if that is your aim. The best a half-hearted effort is going to get you is a blind future member of a soprano boys choir. Sakura stared at her teammate in shock, before nervously licking her lips and looking towards Gaara. She hesitatingly took a step forward, then turned back to Naruto, objecting, "But it's my first kiss." Naruto sighed, shrugged, rolled his eyes and spread his hands. "Okay, look, I know those are valuable, but let me put it this way, would you trade that in return for Sasuke's life?" Thinking about it only a second, Sakura nodded. Naruto put his arms behind his head but regarded her kindly. "If it helps, close your eyes and imagine it as Sasuke. Picturing it as someone I like helps me sometimes get over the initial awkwardness." "When did you ever kiss?" Sakura shot back at him. Naruto rather pointedly did not answer, just pointing a finger towards Gaara, as if to say she had other business she'd best be considering now. At first sighing, then stiffening her resolve, Sakura nodded and marched off to do her duty for Sasuke and her village by smooching the enemy. Yes, if those infiltration agents could bear to do it, so could she. Seeing Sakura approach him, Gaara turned to his sister, blaring at her. "Temari." "Right." She rolled her eyes, careful he couldn't see it, and went over on her own to make out with the demon container for Konoha. As she thought of how good a kisser he was, though, the duty suddenly seemed much less terrible and she licked her lips in anticipation. Both teams got directly to the tower without serious interruption. Gaara was more than capable of getting scrolls for each of them, and wasn't about to give up on Sakura's company, fumbling and hesitant though her makeout was. She never did put any heat into her kisses, though, so the Sasuke she got back as they entered the tower doors was due for a change of career to that blind boys choir Naruto had mentioned. Sakura spent the rest of that week nurturing the grieving, maimed Uchiha, and Naruto spent it practicing his chakra control and hanging out with the Sand siblings, who, as he'd known before, were surprisingly good company. Then the prelim match put him up against Gaara, and he had to bow out, as there was just no way he could beat him without access to more techniques than his presently miserable chakra control allowed him. And getting crushed like a grape was a miserable way to end a day.